Hi, I'm Bryce Crittenden.
Hi, I'm Caroline Land, and welcome back to EPL's Overdue Finds.
Caroline, how are you today?
I am doing really well, Bryce. Guess what I watched on television last night?
Ooh, what did you watch?
It was an episode of Murder, She Wrote, which is not the special part. The special part is that it featured someone we talked about last week, Robert Stack, as a special
Ooh,
guest star.
ooh. Now, not to play
Spoiler alert!
spoiler alert, but
This
was
is probably the earliest spoiler alert we've ever
yeah,
had
pretty much 10
on the
seconds into the
show.
episode.
Yeah.
Now, was Robert Stack the murderer in that episode?
I will tell you this, Bryce. He certainly had a lot of motivation to be.
Ooh. Okay. So now you have to apologize.
Mhm.
I have to apologize to you because I don't think I've ever watched a single episode of Murder, She Wrote. I know it's very shocking to you and probably most listeners, but now is Murder, She Wrote one of those shows where like they show like who the guest stars are like during the opening credits?
Yes.
So like Caroline, when you're sitting down to watch this, you see Robert Stack come up. You're like, this is going to be good and
Yeah.
probably really creepy.
Yes, I would have thought that if I had been paying attention and watching the credits at the beginning of the show, but I was kind of half doing something else. I was probably on my phone while I was watching, and then all of a sudden you hear this voice that you recognize, and you look up and it's Robert Stack angrily confronting a man who has swindled him in a business deal, and
Ooh.
he's vowing his revenge.
Caroline, I don't know about you, but Robert Stack would be one of the last people I'd want to ever cross in any way because I imagine he could probably make some bodies disappear if he really need to.
Gave a powerful performance. I'll leave it at that.
Nice. And I imagine too, there was probably a part of you too who's like, are we going to have some ghosts or Bigfoot or something like that in this episode?
Yeah, but the good news is that even if that happened, Jessica Fletcher would have it covered. Nothing gets to her.
No, not at all. We clearly need to do an episode of future episode of Overdue Finds on Murder, She Wrote, because I have a feeling that you've got quite a bit to say on that topic.
Oh, 12 seasons worth to say on Murder, She Wrote, for sure. How are you doing today?
Yeah,
I didn't
good.
even ask. I just barreled right in with my Murder, She Wrote content.
Hey, I mean, you know what? That ties into our last episode, and it totally made sense to kind of lead off with the Murder, She Wrote talk. But Caroline, I have to ask you.
Yes.
Did you bring your 20-sided dice today to our recording?
I didn't, but I feel like I might be inspired to pick up some after this.
Yeah, I am too. It's funny because when I was preparing my notes for today's episode, and by the way, I should lead off and say today we are talking all about Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, the very popular tabletop role-playing game. Caroline, when I was doing my research for this one, I kind of wanted to lead off with something about dice, and dumb me, I was like, is there such thing as 20-sided dice? So I had to like look this up, and oh yes, there's many different options for dice out there. And not only options, but like there's some that are like very expensive. Like we're talking like hundreds of dollars.
Wow. I have a lot to learn in this area.
I think we're both going to learn a lot because today joining us as we talk about Dungeons and Dragons is a member of the Overdue Finds family, official friend of the show, Meg DeForest. Meg, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited about this episode, so I'm looking forward to talking about D&D for a little while.
I should lead off. You're almost, I want to say, like, I know we have lots of librarians in the system here at EPL who do play Dungeons and Dragons, but I almost want to say, like, just because you're on our show talking about it, we're going to crown you the official EPL Overdue Finds D&D expert. So
perfect. I'll be your correspondent in future episodes. You ever like need a D&D opinion, you can let me know and I'll chime in from the field.
If we have any like D&D based questions that come up, we say, hang on, and then we'll like put in a call, which we might be able to do even at the new Milner recording studios.
I can confirm we will be able to do that in the new recording studios. So
well, now we have to.
Yeah, exactly. But before we get started, Meg, I have to quickly mention you're actually going to be running a program with us coming up on September 22nd called D&D at EPL Character Studio. So I'm actually registered for it. I'm really looking forward to learning more about D&D and start this. And like I said, today we're talking all about it. So for those of you who maybe haven't played it in a while or have never played it before and are just looking to learn more about the game, that's what today's episode is going to be all about. And yeah, we think everybody's going to really enjoy our discussion today. But let's chat about our recent overdue finds first. Meg, what have you been enjoying lately? And now you kind of joked last episode that you were reading a fantasy novel. Do you have another fantasy novel recommendation today?
I don't. I finally broke the streak of only recommending fantasy books, and I picked some music this time. So I have been, as everybody, I think, working from home and using a little more music in my daily life. And so I was checking out on Hoopla Panic at the Disco and Death of a Bachelor. And for me, I've always listened to more indie folk music, so like Rilo Kiley and Elliott Smith. And I sort of knew of Panic at the Disco, but I never really sat down and listened to a full album of theirs. And I think it's actually really great for working because it's really upbeat and has a lot of that really great energy, but it's not, I don't want to sort of like rag on pop music, but I think some pop music can get a little annoying or maybe repetitive. And so that's sort of nice to have something that has that pop feeling and real energy, but isn't going to kind of drive you nuts when you're listening to it over and over again. So I definitely recommend Panic at the Disco on Hoopla.
Now, have you been listening to some of their older stuff or their newer releases? Where are you at in their catalog?
I've sort of started at the newer stuff, and then I think I'm going to kind of work backwards. That's kind of how I usually go with music. So see if I like it enough to commit to the whole back catalog.
Makes sense.
So after listening to Panic at the Disco, are you tempted now to kind of incorporate a little bit more pop into your working from home playlist?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially maybe as we're going into the fall and the days are getting a little colder, it's sort of nice to have something with a little more of that energy. And yeah, so I think I'm definitely going to be looking for some more pop options to add into the rotation.
Nice.
Yeah, an Elliott Smith soundtrack day and a Panic at the Disco soundtrack day are going to be two very different days.
Right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Caroline, besides Murder, She Wrote, and actually I have to ask you, just in case our listeners really want to watch that episode with Robert Stack, because I kind of do now, what season and episode do you happen to know?
I know that it's season 2 of Murder, She Wrote. So it's taking place in like around 1985 era.
So this is like pre-Unsolved Mysteries.
Pre-Unsolved Mysteries, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, we will be on a watch out for that. But besides Murder, She Wrote, what else have you been enjoying?
I wasn't going to do a movie this week. I have been incorporating a lot of movies since I came back from being laid off, and one of the things I said was, Caroline, mix it up. But then I didn't. So my movie, like many people, following the death of Chadwick Boseman, has been to revisit Black Panther. I really enjoyed his other movies like Get On Up and 42, and Black Panther. I've talked about it in the past on the podcast. It has been my March Madness pick to go. The first year it was to go all the way. The second year was to go to the final. I've talked a lot about how much I really like that movie, and rewatching it since he died, I was expecting to really focus in on his performance, and I did, of course, because it's the central figure, it's so strong. But it wasn't long into the movie as I'm watching it, and all of the other characters are just also so strong, and particularly the female characters in the movie. There's humor in the movie, there's relationships in the movie. Even the characters that you don't agree with, you can understand their motivations. The music of the movie, the set design is incredible. The costume design, the look and sound of the movie. I've talked a lot about why I'm a big fan of Black Panther. I really encourage people to go back and see it. I also have talked about how I'm not the biggest fan of Avengers Endgame, but I will say, without spoiling too much, because we've already used the spoiler alert warning, but without spoiling too much, the first time you see the Black Panther character in Endgame is by far one of the best moments of that movie.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to go back and watch it again after hearing about it, how he passed away, and just very, very sad. And it is a movie now, just especially with everything that's going on, and you've seen kind of this after he's passed away, like a lot of tweets and a lot of stuff online about how much that movie has meant to a lot of people. And it just kind of makes his passing away all much more sad, I guess. Definitely, I can't agree with you, Caroline, enough. So definitely hope people go back and watch it.
Yeah, a lot of his movies, they are being checked out of the library right now. One of his later ones that was outside of the Marvel universe was 21 Bridges. It's available. Look for it on our Hits to Go shelves, as well as available to stream from the library if you can't get your hands on a copy of that. So, Bryce, what have you been enjoying?
Yeah, so I've been kind of really on this documentary kick lately. It's funny because there's lots of new movies I want to see. I did actually see Tenet the other week, but that's not my Overdue Finds pick. That's a discussion for a whole
I've been meaning to talk to you about that,
episode.
So we'll have to set some time aside.
Yes, have you seen it?
No.
Okay, yeah, we'll talk about it on a later episode then. But my Overdue Finds pick, it was actually a movie that was brought up, Meg, on when we did the episode on our Strangest Finds. Official friend of the show and EPL librarian Beth Kilfoy mentioned a documentary called I Pastafari. So that's a documentary. When she mentioned it, I kind of added it to my holds list and came in and just watched it the other night. So basically this documentary, it's kind of interesting because it takes a look at one of the fastest growing religions in the world called Pastafarianism, or Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. You'll kind of know that you're around people who, I guess, follow the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster if they're wearing a colander on their head or are even dressed like a pirate. So, the documentary is really interesting because it's kind of takes a look at the beginnings of the religion and how it's trying to actually get recognized as an actual religion in different parts of the world. There's people who, of course, try to get their driver's license photo or even like their passport photo taken wearing a colander on their head. So it does take a look at kind of what can be seen sometimes as hypocrisy in other religions. It's a really interesting topic. It's a super short documentary, actually. It's like just under an hour. I think it was one of those documentaries that was crowdsourced anyway. It's funny because, like, obviously I don't want to get into too much religion talk, obviously, on this show, but there's some interesting connections between it and other organized religions and why some other organized religions are seen as more credible. When you see these scenes in the documentary where the members of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster are trying to explain their religion, and they're like, everybody's just like, this is ridiculous. But then they're like, well, why is parting the sea and having people walk between it, why is that not ridiculous? So it brings up a whole other kind of discussion around religion, and it's a really interesting topic, and I definitely think people should go check it out. It's worth the watch.
That, Bryce, is a really interesting thing that librarianship has been grappling with, especially in the last while, around how we classify materials, how libraries classify materials, and what gets called a religion or foundational text and what gets called folklore or myth. That often depends on who is kind of coming up with these definitions and how that works. And, is that way of viewing things still the most accurate, the best way to classify? Those are cataloging conversations that have been happening in the library world.
Yeah, I still think of the first day of my cataloging class. There was a a fellow student who was shocked by the idea that there wasn't one correct number that the book would be cataloged with. And my professor saying, this is going to be a tough class for you because all of our decisions are based on us as people and what kind of library it is. And so I think sometimes people think that there's like a magical way of cataloging that is correct. And we're all people. So of course we're making decisions using our people brains, and that is going to have different assumptions built into it.
Wow. Talking about cataloging today. Murder, She Wrote.
I am really bringing the librarian today.
That's okay. Hey, I know we've got a ton of listeners who are librarians, so this just all makes sense. It's part of the conversation.
And if you want to shout at us about how your thoughts on cataloging, you can email us at podcast@epl.ca.
Yes, I will probably not reply to that email, but Caroline or Meg absolutely will.
We'll jump on that.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into our main topic today. Of course, we teased it at the beginning, and we're talking all about the game, the tabletop role-playing game of Dungeons and Dragons. Just like on our Unsolved Mysteries episode, before we kind of dive into the topic, I just wanted to share a little bit of history about the game and some interesting facts. So Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D as we're probably going to be calling it for most of this episode, was created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and it was first published in 1974. In 1977, it was actually split into two different branches. So there was the basic Dungeons and Dragons and kind of the more structured, rules-heavy system called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which a lot of people have probably seen in stores or in comic book shops. In 2017, so it was estimated that roughly 12 to 15 million people were playing it in North America. There, of course, is some controversy with it. At various times in history, Dungeons and Dragons has received negative publicity, in particular from some Christian groups, for alleged promotion of practices such as devil worship, witchcraft, suicide, and murder. And I love TV movies, and in fact, there was a case with a gentleman by the name of James Dallas Egbert III, and I believe he unfortunately murdered somebody, and that was kind of fictionalized in the novel Mazes and Monsters, and later made into a TV movie in 1982 starring Tom Hanks. Of course, there was also the animated Saturday morning cartoon series that ran from 83 to 85, which I was a fan of as a kid, and there's some very famous D&D players, including Pro Basketball Hall of Famer Tim Duncan, comedian Stephen Colbert, actors Vin Diesel, and Robin Williams was also a fan. And probably the most famous one right now is actor Joe Manganiello, who I think has a podcast or YouTube channel as he plays Dungeons and Dragons. So the game has come a long way since its first inception in 1974. And so I have to ask, Meg, actually, you know what, Caroline? I'm going to start with you because, Caroline, we know Meg's played this before.
Yeah, I hope. I'm getting all my hopes.
This whole episode goes off the rails right here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Caroline, I have to ask you, have you played Dungeons and Dragons before?
I have not. The sum total of all of my Dungeons and Dragons knowledge comes from two places. The first is the episode of Community called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where they play Dungeons and Dragons. And the second is the episode of the TV show Freaks and Geeks, where the geeks, you play Dungeons and Dragons with the James Franco character, and they bond over that experience. So that we have now tapped out my knowledge.
I mean, other famous ones are Stranger Things plays a lot of D&D, and there's an episode, I think, of Big Bang Theory that's very focused on D&D as well. So I think a lot of people know it from maybe those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was popular before Stranger Things came out, but it seemed to me anyway, as kind of a D&D outsider kind of looking in, that Stranger Things really helped boost its profile, and a lot of a lot of people like myself who kind of grew up in the 80s, and this D&D was kind of more of a fringe thing. It kind of brought it to the forefront again for a lot of us. I told this story on the podcast before. I don't remember what episode it was, and my apologies to my dad if he's listening to this episode, because I remember as a kid, I was probably in elementary school, grade 5 or grade 6, and I've only played it once, and this was my only time. I was over at a friend's house. I played it, came home, and was like super excited. I had a blast playing it. And so I'm telling my dad about this, and I'm just like, oh, this is awesome. Do you think like, I could, maybe this weekend we can go to the mall or something and pick up some stuff and start playing this on a more regular basis? And my dad looked at me and he was very serious. And he said, it's like, Bryce, I don't want you playing that ever again. Only people who worship Satan play Dungeons and Dragons. So what was funny about that is that, one, it wasn't true at all. And two, my family was by no means religious. So the fact that this really concerned my dad that much was kind of funny to me now that I look back on it. But we're going to talk about kind of those things later on. But Meg, obviously you play this quite a bit. How long have you been playing for, and what is it about the game that really kind of drew you to it?
Yeah, so I've actually been playing for over 20 years, and I do think it's always interesting to hear those stories about Satanism, because I did learn to play with my dad, who's an Anglican priest. I think I've mentioned that on the podcast before. And so I do promise that you don't have to be a Satanist to play. I played with many religious people, more religious, it sounds like, even than Bryce is concerned that, and it was fine. I mean, I definitely remember early days when I started playing. I really liked it because I could hang out with the grown-ups, and it was kind of a cool thing to do. And I definitely played at the cottage once and noticed it was midnight, and all of the adults were like, why are we letting this child be awake? And they sent me to bed and almost killed my character. And I still haven't forgiven you, Rick, just so you know, if you're listening to the podcast, I still think about that day.
Not cool, Rick.
No,
not
it was
cool.
not cool.
Come on, Rick.
So yeah, I mean, I think that as a kid, it's well known to listeners of the podcast, I'm a big fantasy reader. And so for me, I really liked the element of getting to go into those fantasy worlds with those elves and those characters that you know from books, but also then to tell your own stories and create your own characters. I think it's really a chance to maybe be more creative than some of our pastimes are. Sometimes it's, if you're watching TV or movies, it can be really passive. And so I think that there's something really nice about playing a game like this where you get to kind of use your creativity and as well as, having the social aspect.
What would you say to someone who is maybe thinking about playing? They might be a little overwhelmed by the idea of it. They might want to dip their toe in. What would you say to someone who isn't sure about starting?
Yeah, I think some people have either those impressions that we've sort of mentioned, that maybe it's a little scary, or there's a lot of rules, or they don't really feel comfortable. And I would just say that there can be so many different kinds of adventures. Like, as I sort of said, there's that broad range. And so you can have adventures even for all ages. I know lots of people who play with really young kids or nostalgia. My sister ran a game once that was very heavily influenced by She-Ra and He-Man. And so like you can kind of go any direction with a D&D game. So I think you don't have to worry that it's going to be really heavy on demons and, those sorts of things. If that's not the kind of game that you want to play, you can really go in different directions. And because it's so cooperative, like I think that's a nice thing to do with your friends too. So like you don't have to, it's not like you're going to be doing it by yourself and having to figure out all the rules and you're sort of shut in this room and figure it out. And, there's a test at the end. I promise there's not. And your friends are there to help you with it. And I think that's kind of one of the fun parts of the game too, is that there's the rules that are in the book, but then everybody I've ever played with has what we call house rules, where, as a group, you've just decided that you're not going to look this up every time because it's too much work and you're just going to skip that rule, or you're going to do what makes sense to you guys. And so because it's just you and the 4 or 5 people that you're playing with, you can really make the rules work for you, and you don't have to be really rigid about the rules. If that's not something that you find interesting and exciting about the game, then find a group that's not going to be that rigid about it. And I think one of the things I like about it too is that it's so replayable. Like, I think a lot of people have gotten into board games in recent years, and I love board games, but I do find that there's a limit. Like, there's sort of a limited number of times you can play some of them because you know how it's going to go, and it's like you have done all of the combinations of strategy maybe in that game, and so you know as soon as somebody gets a particular card that they're going to win, and that for me is not as much fun at that point once you know the game that well. Whereas with D&D, because every time you go into a story, even if it's the same story, like a lot of people will have done Lost Mines, which is one of the early beginning adventures for people who just want to try it out. But I've done that with a couple different groups of people, and you can have entirely different reactions to the challenges that are there. And so even though you've maybe played that adventure before, it'll be really different just because the people you're playing it with are different. So,
well, I definitely feel at ease or more at ease, I'll say, because I was doing some research for this episode and reading the Wikipedia page of Dungeons and Dragons. And I had to stop and say, well, Meg will explain this for me on the podcast.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, and there are people who love the rules, and for some people that's what they really like. They want it to be as close to the real world as possible, so they want to know what would happen if I did this attack against this creature and who wins. And so for some people that is the fun part, but for lots of people, knowing all of those rules is not the fun part, so don't worry about it.
Not to bring up another library point, but since we are a library podcast, I will say how that made me think of how we talk about reader's advisory or recommending. And so reader's advisory is when someone comes up to the desk or approaches a staff member and says, do you have anything good to read? And then it's that process of teasing out what they're looking for. And one of the examples I use when I've done readers advisory classes or training or talked to library students has been using the book Harry Potter as an example. And if somebody says, I want a book that's just like Harry Potter, an instinct that we might have is to go, great, here's another series about a boy wizard, and hand that to them. But there are many reasons why someone could like the Harry Potter series. They could like the friendship element. They could love British boarding school stories. They could like kind of the hero's journey as they go through their teen years. It could be because his parents had died and he's like found family. Those will all be different stories. And so it's not just as easy as a one-to-one. So somebody could play Dungeons and Dragons because they love the character creation or they want to have that time with friends, or it could be about the rule following. And so there's probably an important element of kind of being in a group that matches why you're playing.
100%. And that's why I always recommend, like, I think sometimes people may have had a first experience with a game and they don't like it, or they felt off put by something. And I do recommend maybe try to ask those questions even before you get started, or maybe playing what we sometimes call a 0 session or a one-shot game where you just say, I'm not going to commit to joining this forever, but I'm going to come by for one Saturday afternoon and we're going to see if this is something that we all play the same style. Because yeah, I mean, there's all of the elements you talked about. There's also some people who get really heavy into role playing and they'll get really annoyed if you don't come and like have a voice for your character and only speak in your character's voice. And then other groups are like, oh guys, that's way too much for me. Like, I'm just going to tell you that my character does a thing and that's going to be as far as we go. And so I think it is really important to find that group that has the level of play that you're interested in, or you're going to be like, I just want to kill things. And they're like, no, we're going to have a long session about what we did on our vacation as our characters. And I learned to weave. And it's like, this is not going to be fun for everybody at all.
Yeah. So use that reference interview style.
Yeah, exactly. Check in.
Yeah. So, Meg, I have to quickly ask you, just because I'm a huge fan, but you mentioned your sister, I think, was running a game where they were using characters from She-Ra and He-Man.
Yeah, we had to
That sounds pretty awesome.
We had to go and get the sword. She-Ra had lost her sword, and so our group of adventurers had been sent to retrieve it so that she could save the kingdom. So, I mean, it's a lot of fun, and I think there's something nice, as Caroline was saying, some people like to make characters, and some people don't like to make characters, and so I've definitely played with people where they just like to take a character from a movie or a film and figure out like what would that look like in D&D, what would their skills be. And then that's also easier if you're maybe somebody who hasn't played before, because then you know, well, I know how She-Ra would act in this situation, so I don't have to figure out like what my character's reaction would be. You'd be like, she would hit things with her sword, or she would go and get her friends. And so it does give you a bit of a cheat sheet, because I think when you know a character, that helps maybe people as well. So it can be anything. And I think sometimes people think D&D has to be like the scary Demogorgon is coming and we're all going to fight the dragon. And it's like, it can be really silly too. And both of those are really fun.
That seems like a really great point for especially new players anyway. And great tip there where it's like, you know what, I'm going to send Marty McFly back into this. And what would he do in this situation?
Definitely.
So, we talked about that and how, like, obviously you need to come up with your own characters, but like Meg is our resident D&D expert. What do listeners need to do, I guess, to get started playing? Because obviously it's not quite as simple as laying out the Monopoly board and everybody rolls the dice and plays, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it is a little more complicated, but a lot of the elements are very much the same. And I think that can help to think about maybe a Monopoly as a game when you're thinking about what you need to get started. So as we were talking about at the beginning, you do need dice. So it may be a more complicated dice than you're going to have for Monopoly with a 20-sided one. Although if you're playing online, lots of websites have digital dice now. So you don't necessarily need a physical die, although a lot of people who play D&D, we get really into collecting dice because you can find some really fun ones. There's actually some people in Edmonton. There's a ice cream dice who makes his own resin dice, and you can buy them here locally. And I have a set of his caramel apple dice that are really fun. So like, there's lots of things you can do if you want to get really into dice. Some kind of game piece you usually need to put on the board. But again, I've seen everything from fancy 3D printed stuff or things that are like those metal Warhammer ones that you paint to people who use Lego minifigures or, the little people from Sorry because they're different colors. Like you can really go as much as you want to on those. And then similar to the board that you might have in Monopoly, a lot of people will play with a map just because it's easier to sort of see where your character is. I think maybe not all of us are great, at least I'm not, at like imagining things in 3D space when I can't see something. So when you're trying to figure out how far are you from something, are your characters, exploring this area, it can help to have a map that you're going through. But again, that's something that online, a lot of times people will just have an image and they'll just move a little token around on it. And so that can have a couple different forms. And I think we'll talk a bit more about this later, but a character sheet. So when you have the character that you've imagined and you've decided what they're going to be and what they're going to do, there's a bunch of numbers that go along with that. And so you do need that written down somewhere so that you can refer to it when you're trying to figure out things like, if I go and try to hit this dragon, am I going to succeed or not? And so there's numbers on your sheet that help you to figure that out. And that's some of the rules that sometimes people get a bit bogged down in, but it is sort of how you make it, between rolling a die and having a bit of luck. That's kind of how you make the story kind of not just be, oh, well, I say that I killed the dragon. Well, okay, you can say that, but there's got to be some challenge to it. So, and the last part is just the people that you need. So to run a session, you're always going to need what is usually called a dungeon master. Some people call them a game master. So that'll be, we love our acronyms, so DM or GM to go with your D&D. And you'll definitely need some friends to play with, but that's, again, the same as Monopoly. So not a huge list of things, but yeah, it's because the character sheet preparation can take a bit of time, I think it may not be as easy as opening the board and just starting. You do usually need to do a pre-session where you kind of figure out what your characters are going to be. And so that oftentimes people will do that as kind of a first session, is we'll all get together and make characters together. And that can also be a nice way, if you haven't done it before, to get the support of other people to say, okay, how do I do this part? Like, what is this number? What does this mean? Why is it asking me to do this? And if you're all doing it together, that's another great way to get that taken care of together.
So you've talked about creating the characters and having the character sheet. What kind of advice would you give to someone who is creating their character for the first time?
Yeah, I think you want to think about what kind of things you want to do as a member of the group when you're playing. So if your idea of like a fun thing to be doing as a character is that you want to be helping your friends and you don't necessarily want to have to be hitting things, then maybe you want to be a cleric. Maybe you want to be, if people know from like video games, because a lot of video games in D&D kind of come from some of the same places, then you'd be the healer, right? Where you would sort of maybe not have a lot of ability to kill things, but you want to go and heal things. But maybe you like to be really sneaky, or you want to cast spells. And so I think that thinking about what you are going to find fun, like as we were sort of talking about what's the fun of it for you, for some people the fun of it is like, I just want to swing a sword and I don't want to have to think about it. I just want to like have that kind of release of doing something that would be super antisocial in real life, but in the confines of my imagination I can have a really good time with. So I definitely think you want to think about like, what is it that you're going to want to contribute to your group, because you are going to be playing as a group. Then there's some ways to build characters you can use. There's a book called The Player's Handbook that you can get that will take you through step by step how to make those decisions. A really great website that I'll probably mention later is called D&D Beyond. And I find it really helpful for creating a character because it will take you through each step and each decision you have to make as you go. And as Bryce said at the beginning, if you also want some one-on-one help, I'll be doing a session on September 22nd where I can help people with creating characters. I always think about it as sort of thinking about who is your character, what can they do, and what has happened to them. So that'll be sort of like, who is your character would be your race and your class. So what kind of, are you a druid? Are you an elf? Are you those kinds of things? And then the what can you do part is that also part of that. And then there's lots of details about things that people get really hung up on. So the big ones are like your ability scores. So there's things like strength and dexterity and intelligence and wisdom, and you have to figure out what those numbers are. And then people go, well, what is all of this? What does it mean? And it's really just figuring out how good you are at things. So are you naturally a really smart person, and so you're going to see a puzzle and be able to solve it? Are you naturally somebody who's really strong, or you're not going to trip, so you're really dexterous? And sometimes people are really tempted to just want those to be really high in all of the areas. Like, they're like, I just want to be great at everything. But I actually think some of the more fun characters to play are when they're really bad at something. So one of the characters I'm playing right now is a monk who's got a really low intelligence. So she's just sort of dumb as a rock, but she's really she's really wise. And so she sounds like a fortune cookie. So she'll say things that are like, like Kung Fu: The Legend Continues. She'll come out with these really bad lines, and then she'll just wander into situations, and she'll like, we'll end up in a fight because she wandered through a door again and didn't think about checking to see if there was something happening on the other side. So I think that there can be something fun about having a character that has a weakness and isn't just a superhero. Because even superheroes have their kryptonite. So, play with that.
Do you have a different character for each campaign?
Yes,
is that
good
the word?
That is a good word. Yes,
Thank you.
Good choice. Yeah, generally you do. And what happens with characters is you'll sort of level them up as you get experience points, which is very similar to video games. And so you'll usually have one character that you play per a campaign, but a campaign could go all the way from level 1 to level 20. Level 20 is the highest level your characters can get. But if you are somebody who gets really into it and starts playing with different groups and things like that, then you might have a couple different characters going at the same time. And again, as you said, for some of those people, that's the fun. They like to create those characters. And so some people will do a bunch of one-shots because they just want to keep making a new character every time. They're just like, okay, yeah, I don't care. But other people really get really attached to their characters, and they have like a really strong affinity for them. And it's kind of an ongoing joke in the D&D community that your first character that you create when you very first start is like who you wish you were, right? So like if that's your idealized version where like, you want to be that. And then by the time you've been playing for a while, like your character might be like a group of raccoons in a trench coat. Like people just get weird and they just have fun with it. Like one of my favorite authors, Shannon McGuire, plays D&D, and she talks about her character on Twitter a lot. And she's like, yeah, she's a tiefling, but she thinks that she's like this other kind of race because she was adopted by them. So she's like really mad she's not an alligator. Like she's really mad and like has a delusion that she's an alligator. And you're like, okay, sure, that's your character. Your character thinks they're an alligator. And so it can be really fun to create those different characters, especially as you go on and you kind of want to try new things with them. You can do that. So yeah.
I have so many questions, but I think maybe I'll need to go home to this program and find out all the intricacies of characterization.
Yeah. Well, one of the ones, like I said before, like the She-Ra campaign, last Christmas we did a Christmas one-shot and we took characters from Christmas movies and we turned them into D&D characters. So we had like John McClane, Cindy Lou, who Griswold from A Christmas Vacation, and we all had to go and save Santa from a vampire Krampus. And so like, it can be a lot of fun to create those fun characters and do something a little bit different.
So part of this too is, you mentioned about playing with a group of friends, but since COVID, that's not really the case right now. That's definitely more of a challenge. So what type of tips, or do you have any advice you would give to people who maybe want to start playing, but maybe have to play online?
Yeah, there's some great ways to play online these days. And you can make it kind of as complicated or as simple a setup as works for you and your group. So I mentioned earlier D&D Beyond. They have really great character sheets. I think most people I know who play online use them for the character sheet. Roll20 is another great website, and I'll make sure these are all get to Bryce for the show notes, so you don't have to worry about writing these down. So Roll20 is a better place for maybe doing the actual game. It's got a great setup where you can put those images in and have tokens and put the tokens in for monsters and things like that, and a chat screen. So some people will choose to play over chat and some will do it over voice. And so in Roll20, there is a chat area if that's how you want to play. Or even just over video chat. I know some groups who will just have the dungeon master set up the map and the characters at their house and then put a laptop on it with a, Facebook video, and then everybody else joins a group chat and they just do it that way. So it can really be as complicated as you want, or it can just be an online version of the offline game if that works better for you and you have a setup that works for that. If I do want to say for people, as we talked about, maybe if you're looking for a group and maybe you don't have friends of your own who want to play and you're looking online, there are places to look for groups online. There's a whole subreddit dedicated to it. As I did say a bit earlier, you do want to think about asking some questions and doing that reference interview maybe before you jump into a game, especially if it's online. You may want to talk about like how often are they going to play? What kind of time commitment are they looking? Some groups want to meet weekly. Some want to do like a full day Saturday or Sunday once a month. And again, those role playing and how serious are they? Are they okay if you joke around? Do they want you to be in character the whole time? And as I said, there's no right answer for this. You just want to make sure you find a fit for your personality when you're doing that, so that you're not getting into a game that's a little over your head.
I'm now rethinking my answer to a question we have coming up later. And this has been helpful. So far you've given some advice to listeners like us who are new to the game or have never played before. You've played D&D for a while. Did you say over 20 years?
Over 20 years, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
When you started, so I'm just doing the math in my head, there was the internet when you started.
But just barely. And we definitely were not playing online. Internet. And not this internet. And I remember back then we used to like imagine things like that we have today, where we'd be like, imagine if you had like basically a tablet, right? Where like you could put something in the middle of the table and you could like move your things on, and like, what if you could no, we didn't think of it as texting or like whisper chat or anything, but like, what if you could send messages to this and like the dungeon master could tell you that your character sees something, but not tell the whole table, and like it would be a secret because we would have to like pass physical notes to people if you wanted that to happen. So like it was very old school paper and pencil and like little figures, and we would sort of dream of like, oh, wouldn't that be cool? And nowadays we're just like, yeah, let's play on a screen like that, and of course I'll just send you a chat and nobody will know that you got secret information that nobody else knows. And it's like, yeah, we're in the future, it's fine. Obviously we could do that. So there have been some technology things that make it easier to play, but I do think that the heart of the game is still like the exact same thing that when I was playing when I was like 10 and 11 years old. Like that part is still the same.
Yeah, and I think that would, like, if we watch it on something like Stranger Things, where they're not using Whisper or the internet or like video calls to be interacting with each other, there's still that heart of it that is the same. So it doesn't need to look the same 100%. But are there any online resources that you can recommend for veteran players to check out?
Definitely. I think that there's some great online groups. Again, Reddit has D&D Next, which has some really great resources. And it can be really helpful too if maybe you're somebody who's been a player for a while and you're starting to Dungeon Master, which can be a kind of interesting transition as, maybe you've played for a while. Now you're going to be in charge of the fun for everybody, and that can be a bit intimidating. There's some great resources there, as well as like even good old-fashioned Facebook groups where if you look for a module, if you're going to do it, you can sort of find people who have run it before, and they may have some great maps they put together or suggestions for how to personalize things. Another great one is Hero Forge, and this is like if you're really into your character, where basically you can create an online 3D model and send it to them, and they will print you a 3D figurine of your character that you can then paint, or they can colorize for you, and you can have them doing different positions. So you can have one where they're walking and one where they have their sword or their spell bag out. And so if you're really into D&D and you want like just to have your character represented, I definitely recommend checking that out. It can be a lot of fun. I mean, you can go down the rabbit hole so far.
Meg, a little earlier, you mentioned how when you first started playing, you're thinking about all this like technology that didn't quite exist yet. It totally made me think of, did any of you watch Inspector Gadget growing up?
Of course.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
It was a wonderful show. It always kind of makes me think, like when I hear about that, like, oh, this technology would be so awesome. I remember as a kid watching it in Penny's book that she would use that kind of had like the screen and everything. Mm-hmm. Pretty much Penny from Inspector Gadget invented the iPad, because that's pretty much what it is.
And didn't she have a watch? Yeah,
she had
basically like an Apple Watch. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
People talk a lot about Star Trek really influencing the look of technology, and how there have been designers who've made the look based on what Star Trek did, which is kind of like this self-fulfilling prophecy of how technology would be. Maybe Inspector Gadget doesn't get the credit that it is due.
Maybe Steve Jobs was like a huge Inspector Gadget fan, maybe, and was just like, this is what we're going after.
Especially during that period where Apple computers had kind of faded and had not yet reemerged as the giant it became in the late 90s. So yeah. I think we could be onto something. We should save this for a conspiracy theory episode, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, this was totally going in our conspiracy theories episode for sure. So Meg, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. Dungeons and Dragons hasn't always had the best reputation, obviously, from stuff that we talked about where it was kind of like tied to Satanism. And I know that even for a lot of women, kind of finding a safe gaming space can be difficult. So whether it's like in person or especially online with a lot of video games. So what is it about Dungeons and Dragons that basically that you think makes it kind of more accepted now more than ever?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of factors to that. I think partly that the big resurgence in board games was a big thing, where I think suddenly people were wanting to have something where you could put down your phone and connect with friends, but maybe it's not as replayable, or everybody's then buying new games, and that can get really expensive when you're like, I'm going to buy another game every time we get together. And so there, I think, was this sort of looking for something that could be that social thing. And then I think the timing was really good. A new edition of D&D was released for the 40th anniversary in 2014. And as you sort of talked about, Bryce, there used to be like advanced Dungeons and Dragons and not advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then there was this edition, and I play second edition, and I do this, and then the rules are complicated here. And so really when they came out with what is called the 5th edition, which is what most people are playing these days, in 2014, it really simplified those rules, and it simplified the dice you need to roll. It sort of was good timing that back in the day, to get into Dungeons and Dragons, it was almost a secret society. You sort of had to be inducted by somebody who knew how to play. As we were talking about, like, there wasn't really the internet, and so to play, you had to find someone who was going to play with you and who would teach you the rules. And so sometimes that was maybe not great pockets of groups that were very not welcoming to people. But as we've moved into the more online world that we're in, people are able to both see women playing and see maybe people who are a bit different playing, and also it's a great chance to find those people, and you don't need to have that. You can start a group of friends that are just women playing, and you don't need to have somebody teach it to you, because you can watch Critical Role, or you can watch Geek and Sundry on YouTube, or you can watch these podcasts, and you can see how to play it without having to have that person teach it to you. And so I think that there's also a nice element about it where, because the dungeon master is really in charge of the game, like as long as you have somebody who's running the game who has some good boundaries and some good rules about what's like respectful to do at a table, then even if you have one person who maybe wants to push it and do something that's not so respectful, by having the one person who says, nope, these are the rules, we're going to say, we're not going to do some of the frankly not great things that can happen in gaming. And, we're not going to call this out. We're not going to say that this character gets attacked sexually or harassed sexually. Like, we're just not going to play that game. That's not the game that we play. And so because you can choose that game and you can have somebody in charge of the rules in a way, there's not really somebody who's in charge in a lot of those online gaming spaces to make places safe. And so I think that that's one of the things that has been really appealing to people who maybe don't feel as welcome in other gaming spaces, is that there is that sense of safety. And you can also make your own space. If the space that you find isn't what you're looking for, you can make your own space, and you can make it a safe space, and that you're really empowered to do that. And I think that's a really interesting part of D&D, and I think why it has been adopted by a lot of like queer people and women and just people who maybe don't feel comfortable in other geeky spaces. Because I'm going to tell you, there's lots of geeky women, but they're not always going to be showing up in some places just because it's not for them.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned this on a recent episode of the podcast where I've been playing, especially through the pandemic. My friends and I have been online playing a lot of Call of Duty with each other, and kind of very similar to you. Everybody kind of has their own role on the team and everything. But the point I'm trying to get at is, the one thing that I do find disturbing about it, and as much as I love playing with my friends online, and I know not all players are like this, but you just hear some absolutely horrendous things when you are playing online with other people. I think a lot of that has to do with they're just in short bursts of time. Maybe you're just jumping into a kind of a group battle, and there's always one or two people who are, complete idiots. And yeah, I've heard absolutely, horrible stuff where, if a woman's playing and she says something, and it's just like, guys will kind of just all jump down her throat and say, terrible things. So it totally makes sense with something like Dungeons and Dragons, where, it seems like it is a more, I guess, intimate setting where, you have a group of friends, or, this other group of people that basically you're sitting down and playing like this game with for hours. So, I think that's amazing to hear that, especially more women and, people in the LGBTQ community feel a lot more comfortable and safe playing this sort of game than other online games.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's great to have that space.
All right. So we are unfortunately running out of time. Meg, I have a feeling that you could pretty much talk about Dungeons and Dragons all day. We probably have enough content for an extra episode on it. And maybe we'll get there after Caroline and I go to your character building.
Exactly.
At the end of the month.
Overdue Finds becomes a D&D podcast. I just start playing games and we invite players in.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, we have a special episode where we just play D&D. So let's move on to our quick roundtable questions. Caroline, I want to start with you.
Yeah.
Let's say you're putting together a new D&D group of 4 people.
Yeah.
So yourself, you're in there.
I'm there.
Who are the 3 people you want to play with? Now, these can be anybody. They can be fictional, people from the past, anybody at all. What does your D&D group look like?
So this is the question that I'm maybe going to have to rethink, because my answer now includes, I would first make sure that we all have the same goals for the game.
Yes.
And also that some of the more experienced players would be okay with me learning as we went, because some of them take it quite seriously. My group includes friend of the podcast, Holly Arneson. Holly is great. She and I took a zine making workshop together, and we had a blast. So I think she would keep things fun in a game setting. Then I also had Stephen Colbert, who you mentioned at the top of the show, because I think he takes characterization quite seriously, and he could really commit to creating characters. And then it was also Joe Manganiello, because I want to see this dungeon that he allegedly has in his house where he films his he's I saw an article from earlier this year that said he had been doing a 2-year campaign called The War of the Dragons, and with his like celebrity friends. And I have to admit, I partly want to play Dungeons and Dragons with him, and then I partly just want to hang out at his house and ask him questions. So we'll see. We'll see how it works out. I mean, Sofia Vergara is probably there too. Maybe she'll get involved. I don't know. It's up to her. That's where I'm at right now.
That'd be really fun. And actually, the one thing I do know about him and Sofia Vergara is that they're also big pro wrestling fans as well. So maybe I need to change up my answer for this one. They seem like they'd be really fun to hang out with.
This article I was reading said that part of his group is Paul White from the WWE,
The Big Show.
The Big Show. I was gonna ask if you knew, but clearly you're way ahead of me. And there were these, like I think might add some drama to the proceeding.
I like to imagine a bunch of wrestlers playing on the road, like they just finished fighting, and they like hang out in the hotel room. They're like, you know what we should do? Some D&D. That'll be a good time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's me.
So,
yeah.
Meg, how about you? What does your group look like?
So because I was sort of thinking from the other side of like characters and creating characters, I went entirely fictional. So my group is She-Ra, as I mentioned, just because I think that would be awesome. Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because you need a magic user. And I was thinking about it with the new Disney Mulan coming out. Like she can also really kick some butt. So that I think that would be my television D&D group would be She-Ra, Willow, and Mulan, and I think we'd get things done, and we'd have like a real girl power moment there.
That sounds awesome. So I have to ask, which She-Ra are you using? The new Netflix series or the 80s one?
I think it's got to be new She-Ra. I mean, I have a nostalgic place in my heart for 80s She-Ra, but the new one is really awesome, and I think that would be a lot of fun.
Nice. So from my group, it's funny because my group would change now based on our conversation today and learning way more about Dungeons and Dragons. My group is kind of formed more from an entertainment standpoint in that I'm going to have a blast playing with these people. The only thing is that now, though, is that I don't know how closely they're going to follow the rules. So, for example, I mentioned Robin Williams apparently was a big Dungeons and Dragons fan. So to me, I thought he would be an awesome dungeon master. So he's part of that group. Another guy who I think is hilarious, Ryan Reynolds as well. And my fourth person, I think she's hilarious in everything I've seen her in. Actress and comedian Tiffany Haddish would also be in our group playing Dungeons and Dragons. So you can definitely see where I'm coming from there. I'm thinking like, if I'm going to be in a room with like 3 other people and we're going to be playing this for hours, I want to be entertained, but I have a feeling it could totally go off the rails at any moment.
Oh, yeah. I don't think Robin Williams knew where the rails were most of the time.
No.
So.
No. It would be entertaining.
It would be a lot of fun. You'd have a lot of laughs.
Yes. So before we recorded, I sent everyone a link to a D&D character name generator, which we'll have a link to in our show notes. Caroline,
yes.
What was your character's name, and can you tell us a little bit about them?
I can. My character is Corella Huntinghawk. And I am a female elf bard.
I like it.
I'm also known as Corella the Unvanquished. Or Corella Huntinghawk the Animal Handler. And I had a question.
Yes, yes.
Am I allowed to have accessories, or do I have to earn those?
Depends. Usually your Dungeon Master will let you have one special item when you start, and then the rest of them you'll find as you adventure. But usually you can pick at least one fancy thing when you start.
Okay. So mine is my loot. As a bard, I have incredible abilities with nimble fingers that I also use for stealing. on occasion. And am I allowed to have an animal friend?
You sure can.
Okay.
You can have a familiar.
Then I'm thinking that the hawk would be my familiar because it's right there in the name, but maybe it's a hawk, and then his accessory is a jaunty little cap that he wears.
Ooh,
I'll allow it.
Yeah.
Jaunty caps are definitely allowed.
Yeah. So that's as far as I got with Corella.
So Caroline, when your character is walking around, is the hawk rest like perched on your shoulder, or is it just kind of like flying behind you and it's just there to intimidate people?
Oh, I had not seen the hawk as intimidating, but I like that idea. I think sometimes perched on my shoulder, sometimes perched on the end of my lute, if we're both singing, because I think that's something we might do together. And then maybe just like flying around to like get some attention or something.
Love it.
Yeah. You could definitely train the hawk to like put your hat down and pull it back with like your earnings after you like went busking, and that would be good.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah.
Meg, what character did you come up with? Or you can share your own personal character, whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, the name that the generator gave me was Magana Dark Eyes, which I think is a great name. I'm definitely using at some point.
That.
But I can tell you. I'll tell you maybe about that character I told you about who's really dumb, because she's my current favorite character. So she's a monk. Her name is Akazi, and she's a half elf. She is very wise and very dumb, and so she will kind of get into situations and then say some sort of fortune cookie thing, and then the rest of the group has to come save her, because monks, while being very fast, they're not tanks. They don't have a lot of hit points, so they can get killed pretty easily. And so she's kind of because she's a bit of a higher level monk now, she has some powers from the elements, so she can make her fists flame like fire and then punch people with flame fists, and she can use the wind to push people over, and so I like her for that. She has some funky skills there.
Kind of sounds a little bit like Storm from the X-Men.
Yeah. So, except for, I think Storm is probably not quite as dumb as Akazi. Akazi is really not smart. I don't like to play her as a dumb blonde, but it's more like she just sort of doesn't think things through to their consequences. And yeah.
Bryce, what was your character?
So my character's name was Belinthus Cupshy. So I am a male halfling fighter. So Meg, what exactly is a halfling?
So a halfling would be similar to a hobbit. They're one of the shorter races, and not a gnome, which gnomes are kind of skinny. Halflings are probably more normal sized, but shrunk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So I'm a fighter. My other names are Belenthus the fighter, Belenthus Cupshy the fighter, and Belenthus Cupshy the cook. So when I saw fighter and cook there, I couldn't help but think of one of my favorite action movies from the 90s, Under Siege, starring Steven Seagal, where he was playing Casey Ryback, the cook, who just, happened to be this like former secret ops agent who's working as a chef now on this Navy ship. So I kind of, maybe my character is a little bit molded after Casey Ryback from Under Siege is what I'm thinking. He's just this halfling cook trying to get by, but something happens, and when he's got to turn it on, he'll turn it on. And
I like it. Yeah, maybe he's adventuring to get the money for his startup capital on his restaurant. So he's just
I think
he's
so,
selling to get to his goals here.
Yeah, he's very, very noble and just looking after his family, and just wants to start a restaurant, and just gets pulled into all these crazy situations. So I think we have quite the D&D group here formed.
I'm really excited about the direction this has taken.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Meg. We've mentioned that you have this Dungeons and Dragons program coming up. Where can people go to register for it?
Yeah, so that'll be, I'm sure in our show notes, it'll be on the website. And yeah, this character studio will be the 22nd. And it can also be if you've maybe done one before, but you don't remember, or you've never used 5th edition. So it doesn't have to just be if you've never created a character before. But sure, if you haven't, it's a lot of fun to create characters. So please come on out. We'll have a good time.
Oh, sorry. And I was also going to say too, Meg, we also have a blog from you as well. that we haven't, well, as we're recording this, we have not published it yet. It will be published in time for the program, but there's lots of great tips in there, and we'll definitely link to that as well.
And I wanted to mention that also available through EPL in our collection, we have the original motion picture score of the Dungeons and Dragons movie. And so I have no idea how that is regarded in the Dungeons and Dragons community, but if you're looking for maybe some atmospheric music to get in the mood as you're creating these characters, check that out. You can search for that in our catalog, and we'll have a link in the notes. So we hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. I know Bryce and I did, as we created and explored this world. If you haven't subscribed yet, we encourage you to hit the subscribe button so that you automatically get new episodes. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love getting reviews. And even more importantly, tell a friend about the show.
Yeah, as we've mentioned already, we'll have a link to everything that we talked about in today's show notes, including that awesome sounding soundtrack. I haven't seen the movie, Caroline, but I heard the movie wasn't very good. But that's okay. Like you said, it's great music to have playing in the background as you play. So, of course, we love to hear from our listeners. You can reach us on Twitter at epl.ca, and please use the hashtag EPL Overdue Finds, and we'll definitely find your message there. You can also email us at podcast@epl.ca. And hey, if you're a Dungeons and Dragons player, shoot us a note. Let us know maybe a little bit more about your character, and we'll share that on a future episode. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.